Hey photographers, by now you have probably heard that Aperture is one way that you can get that beautiful background blur that we've all come to know and love in professional photos. But you might still be confused about how exactly that works and how Aperture works and what you have to do so that you can get that same effect. Check out this super quick video. We're going to explain it all to you. Before we dive in, let's make sure that we understand what exactly aperture means. I want you to understand that aperture, when we use that term, we're actually referring to how large or how small the opening is in your camera's lens that is letting light through. And you can actually see this in the image that's on the screen to the right. You see the hole in the middle. That is your aperture. That is a small aperture. That setting would be with a larger number. If you're confused about what the numbers mean with aperture, when you see like f16 or f5.6 or f1.4, make sure that you check out our video on aperture and what the numbers mean so that you can get a quick understanding of what that is. But today we're going to talk a little bit about exactly how aperture impacts some of the things in our images. So as a quick review, your aperture is going to impact the exposure of your photo, but it also will impact the depth of field. And in this video today, we're going to be talking about how aperture impacts the depth of field in your photo. So when we're talking about depth of field, we're essentially talking about how much of your image is in focus in both the foreground and in the background. So the key takeaway here is that when your aperture is smaller, more of your image is in focus. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying that the number is smaller. I'm saying that the aperture itself is smaller. So again, if you get a little bit confused between the correlation of the numbers and the size of the aperture, I want you to make sure you review our video on aperture and what the numbers mean. A small aperture would have a number, for example, like f16. That number is going to make your aperture very small. So we're talking about the smaller size of the opening, which would be a larger number. So the smaller your aperture or the smaller the opening in your lens, then you are going to have more of your image in focus. So you will have less blur in your foreground and in your background. However, if you have your aperture wider open or that opening in your lens is larger, then you will find that less of your image is in focus. So you'll have more blur in the foreground and in the background. And that is because of the aperture's impact on the plane of focus, what we call the focal plane. So that may be another term that you hear is the focal plane and how aperture impacts that focal plane. And the next example after this one is going to show you a little bit more about that, so hang tight. I wanted to show you just another example here. We have a more narrow aperture at f5.0 on the left, and you'll see that we have more of the plant in focus and that the background is blurred out a little bit less than when you look at the image on the right. And on the right, we have a wider aperture or a wider opening in the lens. So this aperture was set at 1.4, and you'll see that there's less in focus and that there's significantly more blur in that background. These photos here help you see the same examples, but it will also help you understand a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about the focal plane. So on the left, we have an aperture of f5. That's a more narrow aperture than what we have on the right. So you can see that more is in focus. So if you look at these toy cars that are lined up, you can see that there are more of them in focus and that the ones that aren't in focus are just slightly blurred out. Where if you look at the image on the right, we have a wider aperture, wider opening in the lens at f1.4, and we have less in focus. And if you take a look at the purple car in the image on the right, and take a look at the rug to the left and to the right of that purple car, you can see that everything in line with that car, the rug right there, is in focus. So it's not just the car, but everything on that same plane. So everything that is just parallel to the camera's sensor, that is what we're talking about when we say the focal plane. It's a straight line parallel to the camera's sensor, and that's how much is in focus there. How deep does that space that's in focus go? That's what we're talking about when we say we have a narrow or a wide focal plane. So there's a lot of terminology around depth of field, around how aperture impacts that is used to describe some of these things here. But I wanted you to see in this example specifically a little bit more about that focal plane. So if you look in front of or down at the bottom of the image, you can see how much is blurred out at the bottom. Then you see that purple car and the rug to the left and to the right of it, and how that is in focus. That is where our focal plane is. And then behind it, you can see that it blurs back out, and we don't have that line of focus there anymore. So you can very clearly see the focal plane in that example. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about how our aperture impacts your depth of field and the plane of focus, and how much is in focus in your images and how much is blurred out. Be sure to check out our other aperture videos to learn more about how aperture affects exposure. And if you're still wondering about those numbers, be sure to check out our video on apertures and what the numbers mean.